Yeah, I think it's in the fitness of things that a discussion on Akbar and Abul Fazl should be followed with a discussion on the Dayuni. Historians have usually represented Badayuni as in contrast with Abul Fazl and Akbar, so that one is rational, the other is irrational, one is enlightened, the other is dogmatic. Badayuni has been portrayed regularly in historical literature as someone who was an orthodox bigot, a very conservative theologian. And one of the reasons for that kind of an image is because historians were focused on his historical work, which is Muntakhab al-Tawarikh, and tended to ignore his other major text, Najat al-Rashid. And it is this text that I hope to discuss today. This is a didactic text which defines, categorizes, labels sins. So it's an attempt to create a moral framework for the society, as also demarcate socially unacceptable practices from practices that were deemed deviant. Now, the interesting thing is that if you compare the two texts, Muntakhab al-Tawarikh, the historical text that he wrote, and Najat al-Rashid, you come across very different formulations. Badayuni comes across as an extremely orthodox, conservative theologian in his historical work, but comes across as an extremely flexible, extremely rational thinker in Najat al-Rashid. There is an emphasis on rational interpretation. I'll come to this in a minute. Ijtihad. There is a willingness to accept truth to be inhering in non-Muslim communities. There is an appreciation for the heretics, so on and so forth. So the two texts are totally incompatible, and that remains an extremely interesting mystery for Mughal historians. Now, one explanation for this could be the difference in genre, because Muntakhab al-Tawarikh is a historical text located in the genre of Tarikh, whereas Najat al-Rashid is a didactic text. And there is certainly a relationship between the genre and the nature of the narrative. It has also been argued by historians like Ali Anusheher that the difference in the two texts emerges from a strong resistance in Badayuni to the state participation in religious activities. So he would want to see the state keep away from the sacred domain. And once the state begins to actively interfere in religious activities, he could see a contraction in these spaces available to the ulama. And that is his grudge against Akbar. Leave that grudge aside, leave that anger against Akbar aside, there is very little by way of difference between Abul Fazl and Badayuni. Now that's a very, very radical formulation that Ali Anusheher makes. Now, if this is the case, the crucial test lies in comparing the two authors in terms of their engagement with difference. How does Abul Fazl, or Akbar for that matter, engage with issues of difference, and how does Badayuni engage with difference? Now, Abul Fazl did, as we just discussed, formulated this idea of Sulh Kul as a way of engaging with difference. It should be understood that Sulh Kul, or absolute peace, emerges out of an realization or out of the toleration of difference. Unless you begin to tolerate difference, you cannot have a culture of Sulh Kul. And this is Abul Fazl's resolution of this issue of how to engage with with communities that are external to your own? How do you engage with the other? At one place, Abul Fazl also makes the point that eventually Sulaykul needs to be replaced with Muhabbat-e-Kul. That is to say, toleration of difference needs to be replaced with appreciation of difference. I don't think Badayuni goes that far, but the issue of engaging or issue of how to engage with difference is a core one in Najatul Rashid. And then he begins with this problem of how to engage with the other, of how to engage with difference, by formulating his concept of ijtihad, or reinterpretation. The interesting thing here is that ijtihad, or the need for reinterpretation, the need for fresh interpretation, emerges not just because of difference of time, but also because of conversations with non-Muslim communities. That is to say, it is in terms or through conversation with the other that you need to reinvent yourself. And this is an extremely instructive way of engaging with difference. So there is an attempt to reject insularity, even as he works within a theological frame of reference. He rejects insularity and encourages conversations across community divides. Now, in seeking to define, catalog, and characterize sins, that is to say, in trying to draw the line that separates unacceptable deviant practices from the ones that are deemed acceptable, the interesting thing is that he does not exclusively depend on the Islamic law. That is to say, he does on occasion cite the Quran and the Hadith to justify the labeling of a particular activity as a deviant one. But more often than not, he ignores the Islamic religious texts and prefers to cite popular wisdom, popular saying, or Indic traditions as an argument to legitimate his framework of what constitutes sins. So that he in trying to create a normative system, he works within a shared repertoire of norms and beliefs. He rejects the effort to refer to Quran and Hadith to create his own ethical worldview. His ethical worldview is largely derived from a shared culture. So it is clear then that so it is clear that he articulates his ethical worldview, which he calls Shariat, from a shared normative system. And this is a shared normative system in terms that it is neither Islamic, purely Islamic, nor purely Indic. It is actually a combination of both. So that's the first point that I wish to make, that his view of Islam, or his view of faith, or more specifically Shariat, is rooted in a culturally shared space. And this space is neither Islamic nor Indic, but a combination of both. Now that's one thing. The second thing is that even as he works out his ethical, theological position from a shared cultural space, let's not forget that this shared space is an elite space as well. So it emerges not out of a shared interaction between cultures at popular levels. It emerges out of shared cultural interactions at the level of the elites and the ruling classes. This comes out well from his view on education. He says that providing education to a lower caste person is like providing a lamb to a thief. So that lower caste people should be kept away from access to education. And he justifies this position not with reference to Quran and Hadith, but with reference to Indic beliefs. So that he does create a shared normative structure, but this shared normative structure is also marked by a division, a class or caste-based division. Having said this, one must also understand that even as he articulates his faith within a shared normative structure, religious identities are important. Repeatedly in his Najatul Rashid, he affirms and reaffirms the significance of religious identities. So that, for example, applying tika or vermilion on forehead for Muslims is sin. Wearing a sacred thread or janevu is a sin. Venerating the sun is sin. So that religious identities need to be respected, but the articulation of religious identities is nonetheless made within a shared, historically shared cultural space. Right? Now, okay. Yeah. Now, how does one see this? How does one see the articulation or assertion of religious identities by this theologian within a shared cultural space? Does one see this as evidence of, or does this see this as providing an evidence for a prehistory of communalism? I would say no. Because the mere presence or mere assertion of religious identity is not equivalent to communalism. Religious identities can be indifferent, religious identities can be appreciative, religious identities can be combative or antagonistic. It is only when religious identities turn hostile or antagonistic that you have the beginnings of communalism. Badaini's position is to treat religious identities with indifference. And this is, I think, where Badayuni differs from Abul Fazl. Abul Fazl has a view of engagement with religious identities that is appreciative, whereas Badaini would want religious identities to remain indifferent with each other. But both positions do not provide evidence to the emergence or to the prehistory of communalism. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking on Najat Rashid, because that is one of the texts on which not much not much work has been done, except perhaps Professor Yusuf wrote something on that, and then Professor Ishtiaq Hussain Dilli wrote something on that, and that is the entire knowledge which I have about Najat Rashid. There is one question which I thought that I might find an answer, with which you started, but somehow got missed, and that was that, Badaini is the author of two texts. One is a hidden text, which is not to be brought in public. He never imagines that it would be read by people. And he takes a particular position in that text. There is another text which is open, which is available and to be read by all. And there is, a position of compromise which is taken there. Why this difference between these two positions? Is it that in Taqabut Tawarikh it's his real self which is coming out? Because he doesn't want, he's sure that no other is going to know, it's only about himself. And in Najatul Rashid, he's catering to the needs of the people who have been, in fact, shaped by the policy of Sulaikullah Fakbar.
I don't think we can have such an instrumental reading of Badayuni's work. As I said, there have been two arguments there. One is texts that the difference in positions emerge out of the difference in the genre of writing. Tarif tradition had become by the 16th century, had assumed by the 16th century an extremely critical stance. And so he thought he could take those positions. This is a didactic text, so what he states there is what he thinks should exist in an ideal normative world. Hang on. The other thing is, as has been argued by Ali Anusher, so I find his interpretation quite appealing, which is that the resentment against Akbar emerges not out of his orthodox beliefs, because these are not the ones that make Badayuni the person that he is. They emerge out of a resentment against state participation in religious activities, because he could see that the state interference in the sacred domain amounted to the contraction of his space available to the ulama. So he's actually trying to defend the interests of his class when he goes on this vibrant. And let's not forget that no ruler before Akbar had attempted to interfere in shaping the religious order so massively as Akbar had done. The argument, this is not my argument, this is Ali Nushair's argument, the resentment emerges out of that kind of an intervention, that kind of a rupture. And there is this apprehension that the power that ulama exercise over the religious domain will certainly be circumscribed.
I would tend to agree with what you say when someone is a son or a pet. And in the next text, a particular person dies and he says that he's a pet, he's a son. But in the other texts, he takes a position which is quite different from this dichotomy. So why this dichotomy? That is what I'm interested in.
These kinds of contradictions, but I think something also had to do with the genre of writing, because hang on, Nadeem sahab. You look at Qasida, for example, a panegyric. A panegyric, by virtue of the genre, has to praise the patron. And the same author, when he gets on to write history, would end up criticizing the same ruler. So, hang on. So what I'm trying to say is that there is certainly a need to move away from a positivist, empiricist reading of Badayuni and to locate the worldview of Badayuni and his narrative in terms of the constraints set by the genre that he chooses to write.
I would like to say first that this entire exercise, whether this is of Professor Farhat Hasan here or he following Ali Anusher, is certainly trying to defend the indefensible. It's very nicely said that he is resenting the interference of the imperial interference or the temporal interference in the sphere of religion. Can one think that if this interference would not have been on the side of liberalizing the religion, but rather making it more orthodox, more, intolerant, whether the same sort of a reaction would have been there? So these are the questions you have to just formulate. Of course, no answer can come. But this is certain that the man was extremely communal. No doubt about it. You just cannot read whether this Najat Rashid or Badayuni. And there is a sort of a meanness with Kamsa. The way he is treating these concubines who bore him children and all that. It's really nauseating sort of a thing. So one finds it very difficult then to say that also brings, that's very interesting, one should read because you can then see what sort of a life people were leading, even those who were part of the Mughal retinue. But beyond that, to develop a liking for the man or to try to defend, I think it is either Ali Anusher or Farhat Hasan Sahab who can do that. I cannot.
I mean, I don't know how to put it. You see, I mean, I don't know. I tend to believe in a kind of history that refuses to glorify an individual or that tends to insinuate another. So that we need to look at the narrative and the forces. And I think it's not just Ali Anu Shaher, but all those who have read Najatul Rashid, they have pointed out to the inaccuracies and the contradictions that emerge when you compare Najatul Rashid with Muntakhab al-Tawarikh. And it is interesting as to how and why do these contradictions emerge, and in what kind of a worldview or what kind of a mentality can we locate Dayuni? And that's all I'm trying to do.
I would like to end, Bharat, your in that couplet from Barashiko, who says, Behesht aaja ki mullaye nabashar, ze mulla shoro ghogaye nabashar. So I think that is the best said we are talking about.
Not have sort of got it very correctly. But one point that was made in your argument was that there is this sort of an appreciation of divergent religious identities, but at the same time the articulation of divergent religious practices were not being appreciated, right? Is that what you said? And then you went on to talk about the creation of a shared cultural space, shared cultural normative space. So my question is that what was then happening within this shared normative space? If the articulation of those divergent religious identities were not being appreciated, then how can one say that there was a shared cultural space?
It's not that. I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is that he's after all a theologian, and since he is a theologian, he would have his own concerns, his own worldview, and certainly, like any other theologian, religious identities matter. What I'm trying to argue is that even as he articulates, even as he makes a case for the articulation, for the strength of religious identities, his construction of religious identities is made in a shared cultural space. This shared cultural space is a shared historical resource. It does not come from Akbar or Abul Fazl or whatever. It is a shared cultural resource, and even as he wants to move away from it, he can't. Because this is the history. This is the history that entraps him. This is the only point that I'm trying to make.
That's something because she was in times past my student, but
she is my student also, you know. I'm so. Farhat, I mean, I quite agree with your argument, but I have a little problem with your formulation that you are against the glorification of individuals and at the same time against the insinuations attributed to other individuals, which really contradicts what Professor Muzvi has said. So would you suggest that the role of the individual needs to be reassessed all the time, or that the individual is immaterial to the historical process?
Yeah. I mean, I tend to believe that we have a tendency to create heroes out of mortals, and we do so to fulfill our objectives in the contemporary world. So that we needed an Akbar, and we needed to be able to fulfill the objectives of the nation state. But I think after all, we need to move away from a narrative that centers on individuals to a narrative that centers on processes. I think that's very important.
But are these processes then not in dialectical relationship with the individual?
Yeah, but not necessarily with the kings, and they are with individuals who are made of lesser.
you're talking about,
lesser caliber.
You're talking about heroes.
Yeah, there are no heroes.
You should talk about villains also.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
How
If-
do we assess then people like
No,
this?
I mean, if you have a narrative that centers on heroes and villains, you, you're not looking at processes. Yeah.
What cases within the people belonging to different communities? So, in what context are you talking about the shared cultural space being elite? Any aspect about the shared?
Yeah, I tend to believe that the kind of shared spaces that emerged in Mughal India were also elite spaces. So that Mughal India was remarkably successful in building a coalition across community divides. But this kind of a coalition, this kind of a shared cultural resource, deliberately tended to exclude the lower orders. So that when you talk of Sulaykul, or when you talk of religious coexistence, or when you talk of religious tolerance, let's not forget that this is an integration, certainly, but an integration that was achieved at the elite level, partly because of the necessity to create a broad range ruling coalition, ruling supporting classes.
Bracketing individuals, but about this shared cultural space, there is a shared cultural space at a popular level which is extremely dynamic, and it is influencing the elite shared space too. So we just can't dissect the two and look at it, as neat categories and then forget, because there's a huge interaction, and I'm sure that interaction may have influenced. I mean, I'm not familiar at all with the texts that you've referred to. May have had some influences. I mean, we just can't say that the elites lived in a rarefied world, whereas the popular culture had its own, dimensions. I mean, there's a little problem in that. I mean, that's my opinion.
Communally divisive, and that the shared integration that achieved in Mughal India was marked by peaceful coexistence. But what I'm trying to say is that the initiatives that emerged out of state interaction, active state participation in religious activities in the sacred domain, also had this deliberate effort to keep the lower orders out of it. I mean, I might even refer to a very important point that Professor Irfan makes, which is that the Indian ruling classes never actually attacked the caste system. So that one must understand that there is an effort to retain inequities even within a shared culture.